orphan black boy shows a picture to a cop, and within seconds the cop's eyes welled up with tears. What could this boy's past reveal that shakes even a hardened officer? And how does this single image hold a truth that's impossible to ignore? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Officer John Matthews drove slowly through the quiet suburban streets, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the evening darkness. The familiar houses and well-maintained lawns passed by as he completed his regular route. The cool night air carried a gentle breeze, rustling through the trees that lined the sidewalks. Streetlights cast pools of warm yellow light at regular intervals, creating a peaceful atmosphere in the residential neighborhood. As he approached an intersection, the traffic light turned red. John eased his foot onto the brake, bringing the patrol car to a smooth stop. While waiting, he glanced around, taking in his surroundings as years of police work had taught him to do. That's when he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Under the glow of a nearby streetlight sat a small figure on the curb. A young black boy, no more than 8 years old, had his knees pulled tightly to his chest. Even from a distance, John could see the child's shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The sight immediately set off alarm bells in his mind. No child should be out alone at this hour. The traffic light changed to green, but instead of continuing straight, John carefully pulled his patrol car to the curb about 20 feet away from where the boy sat. He didn't want to startle the child by parking too close. Turning off the engine, he left the vehicle's emergency lights on to ensure other drivers would see them. John stepped out of his car, his polished badge catching the streetlight's glow. He approached slowly, making sure his footsteps were audible enough not to surprise the boy, but gentle enough not to seem threatening. The child's quiet sniffles carried through the still evening air. "Hey there," John called out softly, keeping his voice warm and friendly. "I'm Officer John Matthews. Are you okay?" The boy's head snapped up, his tear-stained face reflecting momentary panic. Just as quickly, he turned away, using his sleeve to hastily wipe at his cheeks. John noticed how the child's arms tightened around something he was holding against his chest, though he couldn't make out what it was in the dim light. Maintaining a safe distance, John crouched down to the boy's eye level, his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. The concrete sidewalk was cool beneath his knee, but he barely noticed the discomfort. His focus was entirely on the distressed child before him. "It's pretty late to be out here by yourself," John said gently. "I just want to make sure you're safe. Can you tell me what's wrong?" The boy remained silent, his gaze fixed firmly on the ground. His fingers tightened around the object he was clutching. John could now see it appeared to be some kind of photograph, though its details were obscured in the boy's tight grip. "You know, part of my job is helping people who might be having a tough time," John continued, his voice staying steady and reassuring. "And it seems like you might be having a pretty rough night. Would you like to go somewhere safer where we can figure this out together?" The boy's shoulders tensed, but he didn't move away. John could see the internal struggle playing across the child's face, the desire for help warring with the instinct to stay guarded. The officer remained patient, giving the boy time to process his words. After what felt like several long minutes, John slowly extended his hand. "What do you say? Will you let me help you?" The boy glanced at the offered hand, then up at John's face, searching for any sign of deception. Finding only genuine concern in the officer's expression, he finally reached out with one trembling hand, keeping the photo pressed tightly against his chest with the other. John helped him up gently, and together they walked to the patrol car. Opening the back door, John helped the boy settle into the seat. "You're safe now," John assured him as he closed the door. As he walked around to the driver's side, he watched through the window as the boy stared out into the night, his fingers still wrapped protectively around the mysterious photograph. The patrol car idled quietly, its engine providing a gentle hum that filled the silence. John had pulled over a few blocks from his home, wanting to better understand the situation before making any decisions. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the small figure in the back seat. Caleb sat hunched over, his attention fixed on something in his hands, a photograph that he gripped so tightly, his knuckles showed white against his dark skin. John shifted in his seat to face the boy better. "I know this might be scary, but I want you to know you're safe here," he said softly. "I'm Officer John Matthews, but you can just call me Officer John if you'd like." The boy remained silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving the photo. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he responded, "My name is Caleb." "It's nice to meet you, Caleb," John said warmly. "Can you tell me why you're out so late? Where did you come from?" Caleb's shoulders tensed and he seemed to curl even further into himself. "Nowhere," he mumbled, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Is there someone I can call for you, your parents, maybe a relative or friend?" Caleb shook his head slowly, still not looking up. "There's no one left," he whispered, the words carrying such profound sadness that John felt his heart constrict. John's eyes were drawn to the photograph in Caleb's hands. The paper was worn at the edges, as if it had been handled frequently. "That must be a special picture you're holding," he said gently, hoping to establish some connection with the boy. Caleb's fingers tightened around the photo immediately, and he turned slightly away, making it clear he wasn't ready to share this piece of himself. John noticed how the boy's lower lip trembled, though he was clearly trying hard to maintain his composure. "It's okay," John assured him quickly. "You don't have to show me if you don't want to. I just want to help make sure you're safe." The car fell quiet again, save for the steady purr of the engine. John watched as Caleb blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. Something terrible had happened to this child. That much was clear. The way he clutched that photo, his insistence that there was no one left, the deep sadness in his young eyes, it all pointed to a trauma that no child should have to bear. After a moment of consideration, John made his decision. He couldn't leave this boy alone, and a sterile shelter was no place for a child who had clearly been through so much already. "Caleb," he said softly, "I have a warm, safe home not far from here. Would you like to spend the night there? My wife Emma is a wonderful cook, and I'm sure she'd be happy to make you something to eat." Caleb finally looked up, meeting John's eyes in the rearview mirror. There was a flicker of hope in his expression, quickly masked by uncertainty and fear. John could see him wrestling with the decision, wanting to trust but afraid to do so. "You'll be completely safe there," John assured him. "And tomorrow, we can figure things out together. What do you say?" After what felt like an eternity, Caleb gave a tiny nod, his hands never loosening their grip on the photograph. John smiled warmly and put the car in drive. As they pulled away from the curb, he glanced once more in the rearview mirror. Caleb had turned to look out the window, the streetlights casting alternating patterns of light and shadow across his young face. The porch light cast a warm glow across the front steps as John's patrol car pulled into his driveway. Through the living room window, he could see Emma waiting up for him, her silhouette moving as she noticed the car's headlights. John turned to Caleb, who had somehow made himself appear even smaller in the back seat. "We're here," John said softly. "That's my wife Emma at the window. She's very kind, and I promise you'll be safe with us." The front door opened, and Emma stepped onto the porch, wrapping her cardigan tightly around herself against the cool night air. Her expression shifted from concern to gentle understanding as she saw Caleb climb hesitantly from the car, still clutching his photograph. "Hello there," Emma said, her voice warm and welcoming. "Please come inside where it's warm." Caleb followed John up the path, keeping a careful distance between himself and the adults. As they entered the house, Emma's nurturing presence seemed to fill the space. The tension in Caleb's shoulders eased slightly, though his guard remained firmly in place. "You must be cold," Emma said, reaching for a soft blanket draped over the back of the couch. "Here, wrap yourself in this. Would you like some hot cocoa? It always helps me feel better when I'm upset." Caleb nodded slightly, accepting the blanket with his free hand while keeping the photo close to his chest. Emma disappeared into the kitchen, and John gestured toward the comfortable living room sofa. "Have a seat, Caleb, you're safe here." Emma returned quickly with 3 mugs of cocoa, steam rising in delicate swirls. She placed them on the coffee table and sat in the armchair across from Caleb, who had settled into the corner of the sofa, the blanket pulled tight around his shoulders. "I'm Emma," she said gently. I'm so glad John brought you here tonight. Would you like to tell us what happened? Caleb stared into his cocoa, his fingers tracing the edge of the photograph in his lap. The room fell quiet, broken only by the soft ticking of the wall clock. John and Emma waited patiently, understanding that trust would take time. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. There was an accident. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the photo. 6 months ago, we were in the car, me and my parents. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, and she shared a heartbroken look with John. The weight of Caleb's words hung heavy in the air. It was raining, Caleb continued, his voice trembling. Really hard. The other car came so fast. His words trailed off as tears began rolling down his cheeks. He pulled the photograph closer, as if drawing strength from it. Emma moved to sit beside him on the sofa, careful to give him space. You're very brave to share that with us, Caleb, she said softly. I'm so sorry that happened to you. John leaned forward in his chair, his voice gentle but steady. Where have you been staying since then, Caleb? But Caleb had retreated into himself again, his focus entirely on the photograph he still wouldn't show them. Emma reached out slowly and placed her hand near his on the sofa, not touching him, but offering comfort through her proximity. You must be exhausted, she said. We have a comfortable guest room where you can rest. Would you like to see it? The boy was so tired that he slept through the entire night, moving into the next day. In the afternoon, the gentle clinking of plates and the warm aroma of pancakes drifted up through the house. Emma moved around the kitchen with practiced ease while John sat at the table reading the morning paper. When Caleb finally made his way downstairs, Emma greeted him with a warm smile. Good morning, Caleb. Did you sleep well? He nodded shyly, sliding into a chair at the kitchen table. Emma placed a stack of golden pancakes in front of him, topped with fresh strawberries. After breakfast, they settled in the living room. The morning light made everything feel less intimidating than it had the night before. John sat across from Caleb, his expression gentle but focused. Caleb, John began carefully, would you like to tell us more about your parents? About what happened that day? Caleb's fingers tightened around the photograph, but something in John's voice made him feel safe enough to speak. We were going to the park, he said quietly. I got a camera for my birthday, and I wanted to take pictures of everything. Emma sat nearby, her presence offering silent support as Caleb continued. Mom and Dad were laughing about something. His voice grew shakier. I wanted to capture that moment. They looked so happy. Tears welled up in his eyes. I took the picture just before the other car. John leaned forward slightly. May I see the photograph, Caleb? I promise I'll be very careful with it. Caleb hesitated, looking down at the photo he'd kept close for so long. It was his last piece of them, his final memory frozen in time. After a long moment, he slowly extended his hand, passing the photograph to John. John handled it with reverence, studying the image carefully. In it, a smiling couple sat in the front seats of a car, caught in a moment of pure joy. The woman's head was thrown back in laughter, while the man grinned broadly at whatever had amused them so much. But as John examined the photo more closely, something caught his eye. Through the driver's side window, barely visible in the background, was another car. And in that car, though blurry, he could make out a woman's face behind the wheel. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't quite fit with the peaceful family scene. Thank you for sharing this with me, Caleb, John said, his voice steady despite his growing concern. This must be very precious to you. Caleb nodded, relief visible on his face as John carefully handed the photo back to him. You're the first person I've shown it to, he admitted quietly. I promise you, John said, meeting Caleb's eyes. I'm going to look into everything about what happened that day. Would that be okay with you? Caleb's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since they'd met him, a flicker of hope crossed his face. He nodded, clutching the photo close once again. Caleb, John said gently, can you tell us what happened after the accident? Where did you go? Caleb's fingers traced the edge of the photograph as he spoke. They took me to Riverside Children's Home. His voice grew quieter. I didn't have any other family, they said. Emma leaned forward slightly, her face full of compassion. That must have been very hard for you. The first few days weren't so bad, Caleb continued. I was just sad. Really sad. But then, he swallowed hard. Then things got worse. John noticed how Caleb's shoulders tensed as he continued speaking. The warden, Mrs. Henderson, she didn't like me. His voice trembled slightly. She said I was trouble, but I never did anything wrong. I tried so hard to be good. What did she do? Emma asked softly, though anger flickered in her eyes. She wouldn't let me play with the other kids, said I might be a bad influence. Caleb's words came faster now, as if a dam had broken. When something went wrong, she'd blame me. If toys got broken or things went missing, she'd say it was my fault. I had to stay in my room a lot as punishment. John's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. Were there other children like you at the home? Caleb shook his head. I was the only black kid there. The other children. He paused, blinking back tears. They started being mean too, calling me names, saying I didn't belong there. Emma's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes glistening with tears. Oh, Caleb. Sometimes at dinner, Mrs. Henderson would make me eat last, Caleb continued. If there wasn't enough food left, she'd say I should have come earlier, but she made me wait. His voice grew very small. Sometimes I went to bed hungry. John leaned forward, his voice firm but gentle. Caleb, what Mrs. Henderson did was wrong. Very wrong. No child should ever be treated that way. I know, Caleb whispered. That's why I ran away. I couldn't stay there anymore. He looked up at John and Emma, fear crossing his face. Please don't make me go back. Emma wiped tears from her cheeks. No one is going to make you go back there, sweetheart. Not ever. John nodded in agreement. You're safe here, Caleb. What happened to you wasn't right, and we're going to make sure it never happens again. Caleb's shoulders slumped, as if releasing a heavy weight. He looked down at his hands, the photograph still held carefully between them, and let out a long, shaky breath. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room as Caleb settled deeper into the couch cushions. Emma had brought him a glass of water, which he sipped occasionally while gathering his courage to continue his story. The gentle ticking of the wall clock filled the quiet moments between his words. There was this one time, Caleb began, his voice barely above a whisper. When some of the older boys... He paused, taking a shaky breath. They pushed me into the attic and locked the door. Emma's hand flew to her mouth while John leaned forward, his expression intent but gentle. Take your time, Caleb. It was so dark up there, Caleb continued, his hands trembling slightly. I screamed and banged on the door for hours. My throat hurt from yelling, but nobody came. Tears welled up in his eyes. I was up there for 2 whole days. 2 days? Emma's voice cracked with emotion. She moved closer to Caleb, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. He didn't flinch away this time. I was so hungry and scared, Caleb said. There were weird noises at night, and it was cold. When they finally let me out, I thought Mrs. Henderson would help me, but... His voice trailed off. John's hands clenched into fists in his lap, but he kept his voice steady. What did Mrs. Henderson do? She said I must have done something bad to make the other kids lock me up there. She wouldn't let me have any food that day either. Caleb wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. She said I needed to learn my lesson. Emma's grip on Caleb's shoulder tightened slightly, offering silent support as he continued. After that, I knew I couldn't stay there anymore, Caleb said. I waited until everyone was asleep one night, packed my photo in my pocket, and climbed out through the kitchen window. He looked up at John. I walked for a long time trying to find somewhere safe. Then it got dark, and I got scared, and that's when... He gestured toward John. "That's when you found me." John nodded slowly, his eyes filled with understanding. "Thank you for telling us all this, Caleb. It took a lot of courage." "You're safe now," Emma added softly, her voice full of conviction. "We won't let anyone hurt you like that ever again." Caleb looked between them, his eyes still wet with tears but carrying a glimmer of hope. For the first time since John had found him, his grip on the photograph loosened slightly, as if the weight of his secrets had finally begun to lift. The house had grown quiet as night settled in. Caleb's soft breathing could be heard from the guest room, where he had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep. In the living room, John and Emma sat close together on the couch, processing everything they'd learned about the young boy's tragic story. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around a cup of chamomile tea. "I can't believe anyone could be so cruel to a child," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "That orphanage. Those terrible people." John reached into his pocket and carefully pulled out the photograph Caleb had shown him earlier. "And there's something about this accident that doesn't sit right with me," he said, studying the image under the warm lamplight. The photograph captured a tender moment, Caleb's parents smiling at each other in the front seat of their car. But through the driver's side window, partially obscured but visible, was the outline of a woman's face in an approaching vehicle. "Look at this car," John said, pointing to the reflection in the window. "It's definitely high-end. The grille design, the hood ornament, it looks like a luxury model." Emma leaned in closer, squinting at the detail John indicated. "Can you tell what kind it is?" "Not exactly, but there aren't many cars like this in our area. The design is unique." John's jaw tightened as he studied the blurry figure behind the wheel. "If I can identify the model, it might help us understand what really happened that day." "John," Emma said softly, placing her hand on his arm. "I know you want to help, and we should, but Caleb needs stability right now. He needs to feel safe before anything else." John nodded slowly, still holding the photograph. "You're right. We need to be careful about how we handle this. The last thing I want is to cause him more pain." "Let's focus on making him feel secure first," Emma suggested. "Then we can figure out the best way to look into what happened." John set the photograph down on the coffee table, his eyes still drawn to the mysterious vehicle in the background. "I'll start by checking luxury car models from that year. There can't be too many that match this profile." "Just promise me you'll be careful," Emma said, squeezing his arm gently. "For Caleb's sake." "I promise," John replied, his determination evident in his voice. He picked up the photograph again, memorizing every detail of the car's outline before carefully tucking it away in his pocket. Next morning, Officer John decided to visit the orphanage where Mrs. Henderson was. He wanted to see for himself if the conditions are as bad as Caleb said. The drive to the orphanage took 20 minutes. The building loomed before him, a dreary 3-story structure with peeling paint and rusty gutters. Dead leaves scattered across the unkempt lawn, and several windows were covered with aged newspaper instead of curtains. Inside, the air felt stale and cold. A receptionist directed John to the warden's office, where Mrs. Henderson sat behind a cluttered desk. She was a heavy-set woman with small, calculating eyes and thin lips pressed into a permanent frown. "Officer Matthews," Mrs. Henderson said, not bothering to stand. "What brings you here?" "I'm here about a kid who ran from here," John stated firmly. "He's told me about his treatment here." Thompson's expression hardened. "That black naughty kid? Ran away, didn't he? Typical." John's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "Black naughty kid? You mean the 8-year-old boy you locked in an attic for 2 days?" "He was disciplined appropriately," Mrs. Henderson sneered. "That boy needed a firm hand. Always causing problems, that one. Didn't fit in here." "Didn't fit in?" John's voice was dangerously quiet. "Or you didn't want him to fit in?" Mrs. Henderson leaned back in her chair, a smug smile playing at his lips. "Look, officer, some children just aren't cut out for certain environments. He was difficult from day one." "He was grieving his parents," John countered. "He needed support, not cruelty and racism." Racism? Thompson scoffed. Always playing that card, aren't they? The boy was trouble, plain and simple. I don't much care what happens to him now. John stepped closer to the desk, his presence commanding. Well, I do care. And I want you to know that I'll be watching this place very closely from now on. Every complaint, every incident report, I'll be paying attention. Is that supposed to frighten me, officer? Mrs. Henderson's smile didn't reach his eyes. It should, John replied evenly. Because Caleb deserved better, and I'm going to make sure every child who comes through here gets better. That boy will amount to nothing, Mrs. Henderson spat. Mark my words. No, John said firmly. He'll prove you wrong, and I'll make sure of it. One day you will see. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Mrs. Henderson's bitter expression behind. The hallway echoed with his footsteps as he made his way to the exit, passing bare walls and empty rooms that spoke volumes about the neglect within these walls. Back at home, John settled into his desk chair and picked up the phone. His fingers moved quickly as he dialed a familiar number, waiting as it rang several times. Hey, Mike, it's John Matthews. Listen, I need a favor. John pulled out the photograph, studying it carefully as he spoke. I'm working on a case involving a hit and run. Got a photo here with what looks like a luxury car. Could you help me identify the model and maybe narrow down some registrations? He listened intently, then described what he could see in the image. It's got that distinctive front grille, chrome finish, looks high-end. Probably a European make, maybe German. Mike's voice crackled through the phone as he pulled up records. Okay, based on what you're describing, sounds like we're looking at a limited edition Porsche. Not many of those around here. John leaned forward, grabbing a pen and notepad. How many are we talking about? Let me check. The sound of typing filtered through the line. Actually, there are only 3 registered in this area that match that description. Want the details? Yes, please, John said, his pen poised over the paper. As Mike read out the names and addresses, John carefully wrote them down. Each entry represented a potential lead, a possible answer to the tragedy that had upended Caleb's life. Thanks, Mike, I really appreciate this, John said sincerely. If anything comes of it, I'll let you know. After hanging up, John found Emma in the kitchen. She was preparing dinner but stopped when she saw his expression. Did you find something? She asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. John held up his notepad. 3 possible matches. All of them own the same model car I spotted in Caleb's photo. Emma's eyes widened. That's good news, right? Could be, John nodded. At least it's somewhere to start. But John, Emma said softly, what happens if you do find the person responsible? What then? John set the notepad on the counter. Then we make sure justice is served. For Caleb's sake. Emma nodded slowly, her expression a mix of hope and concern. Just be careful. We don't know what kind of person would leave a child orphaned like that. I will, John promised, tucking the notepad into his shirt pocket. The addresses felt heavy against his chest, each one a potential key to unlocking the truth behind Caleb's loss. John pulled up to the first address on his list, a sprawling mansion nestled behind wrought iron gates. Through the bars, he could see a sleek luxury car parked in the circular driveway, its metallic paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. The model matched what he'd seen in Caleb's photo, making his heart race with anticipation. After identifying himself through the intercom, the gate swung open with a soft whir. John drove up the winding driveway, parking his patrol car beside a marble fountain. A well-dressed man in his 50s emerged from the front door, his expression curious but guarded. Mr. Harrison? John asked, approaching with his badge visible. I'm Officer Matthews. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your vehicle. The businessman frowned, glancing at his car. Is there a problem, officer? I'm investigating an accident from 6 months ago, John explained, studying the man's face for any reaction. Your car matches the description of one involved. 6 months ago? Mr. Harrison shook his head, confusion evident in his features. I'm afraid there must be some mistake. My car hasn't been in any accidents, and I'm the only one who drives it. John thanked him and left, crossing the first name off his list with a sigh. The second address led him to a quiet suburban street where an elderly couple, the Hendersons, welcomed him into their immaculate living room. Their car sat in the driveway, another match for the model he sought. "Oh dear," Mrs. Henderson said when John explained his visit. "We were actually in Europe during that time. Let me get our travel documents." Her husband nodded, adding, "We took a 3-month tour through Italy and France. Didn't return until well after the date you mentioned." Sure enough, their passports and travel itinerary confirmed their story. John thanked them for their time, trying to hide his growing frustration as he headed back to his car. With 2 dead ends behind him, John drove toward the final address on his list. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he turned onto a tree-lined street in an affluent neighborhood. The last house came into view, and there in the driveway sat a luxury car that perfectly matched the one from Caleb's photograph. Not just the model, but the exact shade of paint. John parked across the street, his heart pounding as he double-checked the address. This was it, his last chance to find answers for Caleb. He stepped out of his patrol car and walked purposefully toward the front door, each step carrying the weight of possibility and the hope for justice. John finally stood at the door of the third house, taking in its well-maintained appearance. Though large, it lacked the ostentation of the first mansion he'd visited. The luxury car in the driveway matched the one from Caleb's photo perfectly. Same model, same distinctive silver-gray color. He pressed the doorbell, and after a moment, shuffling footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal an elderly man with silver hair and tired eyes. His posture stiffened at the sight of John's uniform. "Can I help you, officer?" the man asked, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "Yes, sir. I'm Officer John Matthews. I'm here investigating an accident that occurred about 6 months ago." John kept his tone gentle but firm. It involved a black family, a young boy and his parents. The man's face paled visibly, and his hand gripped the door frame tighter. After a long moment, he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Please come in," he said quietly. "I think we need to talk." John followed him into a tastefully furnished living room. Family photos lined the walls, many featuring a smiling young woman with her parents. The elderly man lowered himself into an armchair, gesturing for John to take a seat. "My name is Harold Wilson," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "And yes, my wife Margaret was involved in that accident." He clasped his hands together, studying them intently. She wasn't herself that day. Hasn't been herself since. John leaned forward slightly. "Can you tell me what happened?" Harold's eyes grew distant. "We lost our daughter Sarah in a car accident 15 years ago. Margaret never really recovered. She'd have good days and bad days, but she kept going." He swallowed hard. "That day 6 months ago, she was driving home from visiting Sarah's grave. She said everything happened so fast. The rain, the lights, the crash. She panicked and fled." Tears welled in the old man's eyes. When she came home, she was hysterical. Kept saying she couldn't face another accident, couldn't handle more death. The guilt ate away at her. She stopped eating and barely slept. Her mind... He shook his head sadly. Her mind couldn't bear the weight of what she'd done. John thought of Caleb, of the photograph clutched in his small hands, and the weight of loss in his young eyes. "Sir, that accident left a little boy an orphan." Harold covered his face with trembling hands. "I know," he whispered. "I know, and I'll carry that shame for both of us. Margaret's health declined rapidly after that day. She's in a care facility now. She barely recognizes me most days." Looking up at John with red-rimmed eyes, Harold straightened in his chair. "I want to make this right somehow. I know nothing can bring back that boy's parents, but please, is there any way I can help him?" "Actually," John said carefully, "there might be. The boy, Caleb, he's incredibly bright and resilient. He deserves a chance at a good future." Harold nodded earnestly. "Yes, of course. I'd like to set up a fund for his education, his care, whatever he needs. It's the least I can do." Harold Wilson's hands trembled as he reached for a framed photograph on the side table. The picture showed a younger version of himself with his wife and daughter, all smiles and hope. John watched quietly, giving the elderly man time to collect his thoughts. The morning after the accident, Harold began, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret was reading the newspaper over breakfast, just like she did every day. That's when she saw it. He paused, drawing a shaky breath. The headline about a fatal hit and run. A couple killed, leaving behind their young son. John nodded gently, encouraging Harold to continue. She just collapsed in on herself, started sobbing uncontrollably. Harold's eyes grew distant with the memory. She kept saying, "It's happening again. It's happening again." You see, when we lost Sarah, our daughter, it was also a car accident. She was only 23. Harold placed the photo back on the table with careful precision. Margaret never really recovered from Sarah's death. She'd put on a brave face, but inside, he shook his head. When she realized she'd caused another child to lose their parents, something broke in her. "What happened then?" John asked softly. She stopped eating, couldn't sleep. The guilt consumed her. Harold's voice cracked. 3 weeks after the accident, she had a massive heart attack. The doctors said it was likely brought on by stress and anxiety. She survived, but her mind... He gestured helplessly. "She's in Golden Meadows Care Facility now. Most days, she doesn't even know who I am." John leaned forward, his expression compassionate. "I'm very sorry about your wife, Mr. Wilson." "The thing is," Harold continued, "I've been looking for a way to make this right somehow. I know nothing can bring that boy's parents back, but I've been setting aside money, hoping I'd find a way to help him." "That's very generous of you," John said. Harold straightened in his chair, a glimmer of purpose returning to his tired eyes. "It's not generosity, Officer Matthews. It's obligation. It's the very least we can do after what happened. My wife may never understand what we're doing to help, but I know it's what she would want if she were in her right mind." John pulled into his driveway, his mind still processing everything he'd learned from Harold Wilson. The porch light was on, and he could see Emma's silhouette through the window pacing back and forth. As soon as he stepped inside, she rushed to meet him. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "Did you find anything?" They settled onto the couch, and John took a deep breath before sharing Harold's story. He described the elderly man's grief, his wife's decline, and their tragic connection to their own daughter's death years ago. Emma's eyes welled with tears as John explained how Margaret Wilson had suffered a breakdown after realizing what she'd done. "The guilt destroyed her," John said softly. "She's in a care facility now, barely aware of her surroundings. But Harold, he wants to make amends. He's been saving money, hoping to help Caleb somehow." Emma wiped her eyes. That poor woman and poor Harold carrying all that weight alone. "You know," John said, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking about how we could use Harold's offer to create something meaningful, something bigger than just helping Caleb." Emma leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "What if we used the funds to establish a new orphanage? A place where children would be treated with love and respect, regardless of their race or background. Somewhere completely different from where Caleb was with Mrs. Henderson." Emma's eyes lit up. "John, that's perfect. You know I've worked with children for years. I could help run it. Make sure every child feels safe and valued." "That's exactly what I was thinking," John smiled. "You have such a natural way with kids. And after seeing how you've connected with Caleb, we could create the kind of place these children deserve," Emma said, her voice growing excited. "No more prejudice, no more cruelty, just understanding and support." "A place where every child matters," John agreed. "Where they can heal and grow." Emma reached for John's hand, squeezing it tight. "We could help so many children, not just Caleb. Give them the fresh start they deserve." "And with Harold's support, we could make it happen," John nodded. "I think it would bring him some peace, knowing his wife's mistake led to something positive." They sat together, letting the possibility sink in. The idea of transforming tragedy into hope felt right. like something meant to be. "Should we meet with Harold again?" Emma asked. "Present our idea?" John nodded, feeling more certain with each passing moment. "Yes, I think we should. Tomorrow, if possible. The sooner we can start, the better." Hours after that, Harold Wilson's living room was bathed in warm afternoon sunlight as John and Emma sat across from him, sharing their vision for the new orphanage. The elderly man leaned forward in his armchair, his eyes bright with interest as they outlined their plans. "We want to create a place where every child feels valued," Emma explained, her voice filled with passion. "No child should ever experience what Caleb went through." Harold nodded solemnly. "I've been wondering how to make things right. This feels like the answer I've been searching for." John pulled out a small notebook where he'd sketched some preliminary ideas. "We've been thinking about location options, and there's a property on the east side of town that would be perfect. It's spacious with plenty of room for a playground and garden. The children would have their own rooms," Emma added, "and we'd ensure they receive proper education, counseling, and most importantly, love and support." Harold's eyes grew misty. "Margaret would have wanted this," he said softly, referring to his wife. "She loved children. Before everything happened, she used to volunteer at the elementary school." "This could be her legacy," John said gently, "something positive coming from tragedy." Emma shared her plans for running the facility. "As head warden, I'll personally oversee every aspect of the children's care. We'll hire staff who understand our vision of inclusion and compassion." "And you'll take this on full-time?" Harold asked. "Yes," Emma replied without hesitation. "It's what I've always wanted to do, help children heal and grow." Harold stood up slowly and walked to his desk. He returned with a checkbook, his hands trembling slightly. "I want to fund this completely," he said, "whatever it takes to make this happen." "Mr. Wilson," John began, but Harold held up his hand. "Please," he said. "This is the first time since the accident that I've felt hopeful, like something good can come from all this pain." They spent the next hour discussing practical details: property acquisition, staffing needs, licensing requirements. Harold took notes meticulously, asking thoughtful questions about their plans. "We'll make sure every child knows they matter," Emma assured him. "No exceptions, no prejudice, just unconditional support." Harold's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me this chance to make things right." John reached over and squeezed the older man's shoulder. "This isn't just about making amends, Mr. Wilson. This is about creating something beautiful from something tragic. Your wife's memory will live on through every child we help." The summer sun beat down on the construction site as workers moved purposefully across the grounds. Emma stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, carefully checking off items from her extensive list. The framework of the new orphanage rose steadily against the blue sky, its sturdy beams promising safety and stability for future residents. Caleb walked beside Emma, his eyes wide as he took in the progress. "Look at how big the windows are," he exclaimed, pointing to the newly installed frames that would soon hold glass panes. "Those windows will let in lots of natural light," Emma explained, smiling at his enthusiasm. "Every bedroom will have one, and the common areas will be bright and cheerful." John arrived during his lunch break, carrying sandwiches for all three of them. They sat together on a stack of lumber, watching the construction crews work. "The playground equipment arrives next week," Emma said, showing them the plans. "We'll have swings, slides, and even a basketball court." Caleb's eyes lit up. "Really? I love basketball." "Maybe you can teach the other kids how to play," John suggested, ruffling Caleb's hair affectionately. As they finished their lunch, Caleb grew quiet, his expression thoughtful. "I never thought," he began, then paused, collecting his words. "I never thought I'd find people who cared about me like you do." Emma set down her clipboard and turned to face him fully. "You're family to us now, Caleb. That's never going to change." "She's right," John added, his voice firm and warm. "We'll always be here for you, looking out for you. That's a promise." Tears welled up in Caleb's eyes, but these were different from the ones he'd shed on that lonely curb weeks ago. These were tears of gratitude, of belonging. They spent the afternoon touring the site, with Emma pointing out where different rooms would be. The library was taking shape, its shelves waiting to be filled with books. The kitchen would be large enough to teach cooking classes. Each bedroom would have its own closet and desk. "And this," Emma said, leading them to a sunny corner of the building, "will be your room, Caleb. You'll be able to see the sunrise every morning." Caleb stood in the unfinished space, imagining what it would become. The workers had already installed the window frame, and through it, he could see the spot where the playground would soon stand. "It's perfect," he whispered, his voice full of wonder. As they watched the construction continue, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced since before the accident. A sense of security, of truly belonging somewhere. The orphanage wasn't just a building taking shape before his eyes. It was the promise of a new beginning, not only for him but for other children who needed a safe place to call home. Later that week, the evening sun cast long shadows through the kitchen window as Emma helped Caleb with his science homework. Books and papers were spread across the dining table, and a plate of chocolate chip cookies sat nearby, rewards for completed assignments. "So the heart pumps blood through the arteries," Caleb said, tracing the diagram in his textbook with his finger. His eyes sparkled with interest as he absorbed the information. "That's right," Emma encouraged. "And where does the blood go next?" "Through the whole body, carrying oxygen to all the cells." Caleb's excitement was contagious, making Emma smile. John entered the kitchen, still in his police uniform, and watched them for a moment. "How's the studying going?" "Great." Caleb held up his notebook. "We're learning about the circulatory system. Did you know the heart beats about 100,000 times every day?" "I didn't know that," John said, pulling up a chair. "Sounds like you're really enjoying this medical stuff." Caleb nodded enthusiastically. "I want to learn everything about how the body works. Maybe—" He hesitated, then continued with more confidence. "Maybe I could be a doctor someday." Emma and John exchanged warm glances. "That's a wonderful goal," Emma said, placing her hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You're certainly smart enough." "And determined enough," John added. "Those are important qualities for a doctor." Caleb's face lit up at their support. "Really? You think I could do it?" "We know you can," John said firmly. "With hard work and dedication, you can achieve anything you set your mind to." The following weekend, John took Caleb to the local science museum. They spent hours exploring the medical exhibits, with Caleb asking countless questions about the human body and modern medicine. His curiosity seemed endless. At home, Emma helped Caleb create a study schedule, making sure he had plenty of time for both academics and fun. She noticed how quickly he grasped new concepts, especially in science and math. When he struggled with certain subjects, she patiently worked with him until he understood. During dinner one evening, Caleb looked up from his plate. "Emma, John," his voice was soft but steady. "Thank you for believing in me. No one ever did before." Emma felt tears prick at her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, you make it easy to believe in you. You're capable of so much." "And we'll be here every step of the way," John added, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever you need to reach your goals, we'll help you get there." Caleb smiled, a full, genuine smile that reached his eyes. The transformation from the scared, withdrawn boy they'd found on the curb was remarkable. Now he sat straighter, spoke with confidence, and looked toward the future with hope instead of fear. Finally, the day they all waited for had arrived. The newly completed orphanage stood proudly against the clear blue sky, its fresh paint gleaming in the morning sunlight. Colorful banners and balloons decorated the entrance, where a crowd had gathered for the grand opening ceremony. John, Emma, and Caleb stood near the front, their hearts full of pride and anticipation. The elderly man who had funded the project, Mr. Harrison, stepped up to the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. The crowd fell silent, waiting for his words. "Today marks not just the opening of a building," Mr. Harrison began, his voice steady despite his visible emotion, but the beginning of hope for many children who deserve love and support. This project was born from tragedy, a tragedy that I must acknowledge with deep remorse. His eyes found Caleb in the crowd. Young Caleb, whose parents were taken from him due to actions my family was responsible for, showed me that even the darkest moments can lead to light. My late wife's involvement in the accident that took your parents haunted her until her final days. Caleb stood straighter, his hand finding Emma's for support. Mr. Harrison continued, his voice breaking slightly. I cannot undo the past, but I hope this place will serve as a legacy of healing and hope. Stepping down from the podium, Mr. Harrison made his way to where Caleb stood. The crowd watched in hushed silence as the elderly man faced the young boy, whose life had been forever changed by his family's actions. I'm so sorry, Caleb, Mr. Harrison said softly. I know nothing can replace what you've lost. Caleb looked up at the man, his eyes clear and steady. Thank you for helping make sure other kids won't be alone like I was, he said. This place will help a lot of people. Mr. Harrison's eyes welled with tears at the boy's unexpected grace. You're an extraordinary young man, he said. I want you to know that I'll always be here to support your dreams, whatever they may be. John placed a protective hand on Caleb's shoulder while Emma wiped away tears. We're so proud of you, she whispered to Caleb, pulling him close. You've shown incredible strength today, John added, his voice thick with emotion. Your parents would be proud of the young man you're becoming. The ceremony continued around them, but in that moment they stood together as a family, bound by love that had grown from tragedy. The new orphanage behind them stood as a testament to healing, forgiveness, and the power of compassion to transform lives. The morning sun filtered through Caleb's bedroom window at John and Emma's house as they helped him pack his belongings. His few possessions, including the precious photograph of his parents, were carefully placed in a small suitcase Emma had bought for him. The room felt different now, tinged with the bittersweetness of change. Remember, you can visit us anytime, Emma said softly, folding one of Caleb's shirts. This will always be your home too. Caleb nodded, his fingers tracing the edge of his suitcase. I know. It's just, I'll miss being here with you both. John sat down beside him on the bed. We'll miss you too, buddy, but you won't be far, and we'll visit so often you might get tired of seeing us. He smiled warmly, trying to lighten the mood. I could never get tired of seeing you, Caleb replied, his voice quiet but sincere. You've been like... He paused, gathering courage. Like parents to me. Emma stopped folding clothes, her eyes filling with tears. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small box. I have something for you, she said, sitting on Caleb's other side. Open it. Caleb carefully lifted the lid to reveal a silver compass on a chain. It's beautiful, he whispered. My father gave this to me when I was about your age, Emma explained. He said it would help me find my way home whenever I needed to. Now it's yours. Thank you, Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. For everything. For finding me that night, for taking care of me, for... His voice broke slightly. For loving me. John wrapped an arm around Caleb's shoulders. You made it easy to love you, son. And that's never going to change, whether you're here or at the orphanage. They finished packing in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they carried Caleb's suitcase downstairs, he took one last look at the room that had become his sanctuary. The compass hung around his neck, a constant reminder of the love he'd found in this home. At the front door, Caleb turned to face John and Emma. I don't know how to say goodbye, he admitted. Then don't, Emma said, pulling him into a tight hug. This isn't goodbye, it's just see you later. John joined the embrace, holding his family close. We're so proud of you, Caleb, and we'll see you very soon. Caleb stepped back, wiping his eyes but standing tall. He picked up his suitcase, the weight of it nothing compared to the weight in his heart. Yet he knew this wasn't an ending. It was a new chapter, one where he still had the love and support of the two people who had changed his life. Caleb's first week at the orphanage brought a mix of emotions he hadn't expected. The building was spacious and bright, nothing like his previous experience, but he still found himself missing the warmth of John and Emma's home. His new room, shared with 3 other boys, felt strange and unfamiliar. The compass around his neck provided some comfort as he tried to adjust to the new routines. During breakfast on his 3rd day, he sat alone at one of the long tables, quietly eating his oatmeal. 2 older boys walked past, deliberately bumping his chair. "Watch it," one of them muttered. "This table's not for your kind." Caleb kept his eyes down, his hand instinctively reaching for the compass. Later that morning in his math class, he raised his hand to answer a question. The teacher, Mrs. Davis, barely glanced his way before calling on someone else. When he tried again, she sighed quietly and said, "Perhaps you should focus on the basics first, Caleb." But everything changed when he met Ms. Thompson, his assigned mentor. She found him in the library during study hour, sitting alone with his science textbook. "You must be Caleb," she said warmly, pulling up a chair. "I hear you're interested in becoming a doctor someday." Caleb looked up, surprised by her friendly tone. "Yes, ma'am. But—" He hesitated, thinking of Mrs. Davis's dismissal. "But what?" Ms. Thompson asked gently. "Some people don't think I can do it," he admitted quietly. Ms. Thompson leaned forward, her eyes kind but serious. "Let me tell you something, Caleb. There will always be people who doubt you, who try to put limits on what you can achieve. But their doubts say more about them than about you." Caleb thought about this, remembering John and Emma's unwavering support. "It's hard sometimes," he confessed. "Of course it is," Ms. Thompson agreed. "But you're stronger than their prejudice. I've seen your test scores from your previous school. You have a brilliant mind. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." As the week progressed, Caleb encountered more subtle forms of discrimination. Some children would move away when he sat nearby, while others whispered comments they thought he couldn't hear. Mrs. Davis continued to overlook his raised hand even when he knew the correct answers. But Ms. Thompson's words stayed with him. During their daily meetings, she helped him with his studies and listened to his concerns. When he expressed frustration about Mrs. Davis's behavior, Ms. Thompson encouraged him to prove himself through his work rather than words. "Excellence is the best response to prejudice," she told him. "Show them what you're capable of through your actions and achievements." By the end of the week, Caleb had developed a quiet determination. The discrimination hurt, but he refused to let it define him. During their Friday meeting, he showed Ms. Thompson his completed science assignment. "This is excellent work, Caleb," she said, beaming with pride. "Keep this up, and no one will be able to deny your abilities." Caleb smiled, feeling stronger than he had all week. The compass around his neck reminded him that he had people who believed in him, and now Ms. Thompson had joined that circle of support. As summer approached, Caleb discovered a flyer posted on the orphanage bulletin board advertising the Preston Academy Summer Science Camp. His eyes lit up as he read about the advanced programs in biology and chemistry, subjects that aligned perfectly with his dream of becoming a doctor. The camp offered hands-on laboratory experience and mentoring from real scientists, something Caleb had only dreamed about. "This could be my chance," he whispered to himself, carefully copying down the application details. That evening, he worked diligently on his application, pouring his heart into the essay portion. Ms. Thompson helped him polish his writing, and his recent excellent grades made him a strong candidate. The excitement bubbled inside him as he submitted the application, imagining himself in a real laboratory, conducting experiments alongside other aspiring scientists. 2 weeks later, Caleb sat across from Mr. Richards, the camp coordinator, in a small office at the local community center. The man barely made eye contact as he shuffled through Caleb's application papers. "Your grades are adequate," Mr. Richards said, his tone dismissive. "But I'm not sure you'd be a good fit for our program. The Preston Academy camp is quite selective." Caleb's heart sank as he recognized the familiar pattern. The way Mr. Richards emphasized certain words, his careful avoidance of direct eye contact, it all pointed to the same prejudice he'd faced before. "Perhaps," Mr. Richards continued, You might consider the community center's general summer program instead. It might be more suitable for someone with your background." The words stung, but Caleb maintained his composure. He thanked Mr. Richards politely and left the office, his rejected application clutched in his hand. Instead of letting anger take over, he channeled his disappointment into determination. Later that day, he found Ms. Thompson in the library. "I didn't get in," he said quietly, showing her the rejection letter. Ms. Thompson's face softened with understanding. "Did Mr. Richards give you a reason?" "He said I wasn't a good fit," Caleb replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I know what he really meant." Ms. Thompson placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me, Caleb. There will always be people who try to close doors in your face. But you have something they don't expect: persistence. Every rejection, every no, can become fuel for your determination." "I just thought," Caleb's voice trailed off. "I thought if I worked hard enough, it wouldn't matter what I looked like." "It should be that way," Ms. Thompson agreed. "But until it is, we keep pushing forward. Your grades are exceptional, your drive is remarkable, and no rejection can take that away from you." Caleb nodded, straightening his shoulders. Instead of letting the rejection crush his spirit, he decided to use it as motivation. He would study harder, work longer, and prove that he belonged in any academic setting, regardless of what people like Mr. Richards thought. As he walked back to his room at the orphanage, Caleb felt a new sense of purpose growing within him. The rejection hurt, but it also strengthened his resolve. He would show them all what he could achieve, not through confrontation, but through excellence. As autumn leaves began to color the trees around the orphanage, Caleb noticed a flyer for soccer team tryouts posted on the school bulletin board. His heart quickened with excitement. He had always loved soccer, spending countless hours practicing with a worn ball in the orphanage yard. The prospect of joining a real team made him feel hopeful. When tryout day arrived, Caleb joined the other students on the field, his cleats laced tight and determination written across his face. Coach Richards, a stern-faced man with graying hair, gathered the hopeful players around him. Caleb's optimism faltered slightly when he recognized the same dismissive look he'd seen before in others' eyes. Throughout the drills, Coach Richards barely acknowledged Caleb's presence. While other players received detailed feedback and multiple attempts at different positions, Caleb found himself relegated to the sidelines more often than not. When he did get a chance to play, his touches on the ball were limited. "Thompson," he called out one afternoon, finding his mentor in the library. "The coach, he's doing it again, like Mr. Richards from the science camp." Ms. Thompson looked up from her book. "And how are you handling it?" "I'm practicing every day after school," Caleb replied. "Even if he won't give me a fair chance during tryouts, I'll be ready when my moment comes." "That's exactly right," she smiled. "Sometimes the best response to prejudice is excellence." True to his word, Caleb dedicated himself to training. Every afternoon he could be found on the empty field behind the orphanage, running drills and perfecting his footwork. He studied professional soccer matches on the library computer, learning new techniques and strategies. When the final selection day arrived, Coach Richards organized a scrimmage match. Caleb started on the bench, but when another player twisted his ankle, the coach had no choice but to put him in. This was his chance. The moment Caleb stepped onto the field, everything clicked. He intercepted passes with precision, made brilliant runs down the wing, and set up 2 goals with perfectly placed crosses. His teammates began actively looking for him, recognizing his skill. Even Coach Richards couldn't hide his surprise at Caleb's performance. After the match, the coach pulled Caleb aside. His expression had softened, replaced by something that looked like regret. "I may have misjudged you," Coach Richards said, clearing his throat. "Your dedication shows in your play. I apologize for not giving you a fair chance earlier." Caleb nodded, accepting the apology with quiet dignity. That evening, he shared the news with Ms. Thompson, who beamed with pride. "You see," she said, "you didn't just earn your place, you changed someone's mind. That's a victory beyond just making the team." Years passed by. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as families and friends filled the rows of seats. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting a warm glow over the sea of graduating seniors in their blue caps and gowns. In the middle of the crowd, John and Emma Matthews sat with proud smiles, their eyes fixed on the stage where Caleb would soon give his valedictorian speech. As Caleb stepped up to the podium, his hands trembled slightly, but his voice rang clear and strong through the microphone. "When I think about perseverance," he began, "I think about the people who showed me what it truly means to never give up." His gaze swept across the audience, lingering briefly on John and Emma. "Some of us found our families in unexpected places. Some of us faced obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But what I learned is that no one succeeds alone. It takes a community, people who believe in you even when you doubt yourself." Emma dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while John squeezed her hand, both of them remembering the scared little boy they'd found sitting alone on that curb years ago. "Today as we graduate," Caleb continued, "we carry with us not just our diplomas but the strength given to us by those who supported us, who pushed us to be better, who showed us what love truly means." After the ceremony, Caleb made his way through the crowd of celebrating graduates to find John and Emma. When he reached them, Emma immediately pulled him into a tight hug, tears flowing freely now. "We are so proud of you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. John wrapped his arms around both of them, his usual composed demeanor cracking as he said, "You've come so far, son. Your speech was perfect." Caleb pulled back slightly, his own eyes glistening. "I wouldn't be here without you both. You showed me what family really means. You gave me hope when I had none." "You did all the hard work," John said, placing a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "We just gave you a safe place to land." "And you'll always have that," Emma added, straightening Caleb's graduation gown. "No matter where college takes you, you'll always have us." Caleb nodded, unable to speak for a moment as emotion overwhelmed him. The journey from that terrified, lonely child to valedictorian hadn't been easy, but John and Emma's unwavering support had made it possible. They had shown him that family wasn't just about blood, it was about love, acceptance, and believing in someone's potential. "Ready to head out?" John asked, gesturing toward the exit. "Emma made your favorite dinner to celebrate." Caleb smiled, gathering his graduation cap and diploma. As they walked together through the crowded auditorium, he felt both the weight of his accomplishments and the lightness of knowing he had a family to share them with. Caleb even did excellent in his medical school. The lecture hall buzzed with activity as medical students filed in, their white coats crisp and notebooks ready. Caleb took his usual seat in the third row, perfectly positioned to see the complex diagrams Dr. Mason would draw on the board. The familiar smell of coffee and sanitizer filled the air as his classmates settled around him. Dr. Mason strode into the room, his silver hair neatly combed and his posture rigid. His eyes swept across the room, lingering on Caleb for a moment longer than necessary. "Today's topic is particularly challenging," he announced. "Some of you may find it beyond your current capabilities." Caleb felt the weight of Dr. Mason's gaze but kept his expression neutral. He'd faced similar doubts before and knew how to handle them, with quiet determination and excellence. Throughout the lecture, Dr. Mason called on various students to answer questions. When Caleb raised his hand, the professor often chose others, even when Caleb was the only one volunteering. Rather than letting this discourage him, Caleb channeled his energy into taking detailed notes and studying even harder. Weeks passed, and Caleb's dedication began to show results. His test scores consistently ranked among the highest in the class, and his practical demonstrations were flawless. Other students started coming to him for help with difficult concepts, forming study groups around his clear explanations. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging exam where Caleb had scored the highest grade, Dr. Mason asked him to stay behind. The lecture hall emptied quickly, leaving them alone among the rows of seats. "Mr. Matthews," Dr. Mason began, his usual stern expression softened slightly. "I need to address something with you." Caleb stood quietly, maintaining eye contact as Dr. Mason continued. "When you first joined my class, I had certain preconceptions about your abilities, the professor admitted. I was wrong. Your work has consistently demonstrated not only intelligence, but also remarkable dedication. Thank you, sir, Caleb replied evenly. I appreciate your honesty. I owe you an apology, Dr. Mason said, straightening his tie. My assumptions were unfair and unprofessional. Caleb nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace he'd shown throughout the semester. What matters is that we learn and grow from our experiences, Dr. Mason. That's why we're all here, isn't it? Dr. Mason's eyebrows raised slightly, surprised by Caleb's mature response. He extended his hand, which Caleb shook firmly. As Caleb gathered his belongings and headed toward the door, he felt lighter somehow. Each challenge he overcame, each bias he proved wrong, only strengthened his resolve to succeed in medicine. He walked through the empty lecture hall, his footsteps echoing against the walls, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was headed. One day, Caleb stood at the nurse's station, reviewing his patient charts for the day. His white coat was pristine, his stethoscope draped around his neck, a picture of medical professionalism. As he flipped through the files, a name jumped out at him, making his heart skip a beat. Patricia Henderson. Could it be the same Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had made his childhood at the orphanage so difficult? Caleb took a deep breath, steadying himself against the counter. The memories flooded back, the isolation, the unfair punishments, the cold stares. With practiced composure, Caleb gathered his thoughts and headed toward room 304. Each step down the sterile hospital corridor felt heavier than the last. He paused outside the door, straightening his name badge that read, Dr. Caleb Matthews, MD. When she entered the room, Caleb saw an elderly woman propped up in the hospital bed, looking far frailer than the intimidating figure from his memories. Mrs. Henderson glanced up, her eyes taking in the doctor before him without recognition. Good morning, Mrs. Henderson, I'm Dr. Matthews, Caleb said professionally, picking up the chart at the foot of the bed. I'll be overseeing your care during your stay with us. Mrs. Henderson nodded weakly, but as Caleb began her examination, recognition slowly dawned in the older man's eyes. His face paled slightly. Caleb? Mrs. Henderson's voice was barely above a whisper. Little Caleb from the orphanage? Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, Caleb replied calmly, continuing to check the patient's vital signs. The former warden's hands trembled as he spoke. I never thought I'd see you again. Especially not like this. She paused, swallowing hard. What I did to you, the way I treated you, it was wrong. So wrong. Caleb kept his focus on the medical examination, but he listened as Mrs. Henderson continued. I was a different person then, full of prejudice and ignorance. I've carried the shame of how I treated you and the other children for years. Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know how deeply sorry I am. Finishing his examination, Caleb looked directly at his former tormentor. The woman before him now seemed small, vulnerable, and genuinely remorseful. Mrs. Henderson, Caleb said quietly, I appreciate your apology. What happened in the past was wrong, but I've learned that holding on to anger only hurts ourselves. Right now, my concern is making sure you receive the best possible care. Tears welled up in Mrs. Henderson's eyes. You became everything I said you couldn't be. I was so wrong about you, about everything. Caleb adjusted Mrs. Henderson's IV line with gentle hands. We all have the capacity to change, Mrs. Henderson. What matters is that we recognize our mistakes and try to do better. As Caleb completed his rounds with Mrs. Henderson, he maintained his professional demeanor while showing genuine care for his patient's well-being. When she finally left the room, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a burden of old pain he hadn't realized he was still carrying. Back at the orphanage, Caleb set up his medical equipment for the free clinic day. The building had changed significantly since his time there. The walls were now painted in cheerful colors, and children's artwork decorated the corridors. John and Emma helped arrange the examination room, their presence bringing back memories of how their support had changed his life. Everything's almost ready, Emma said, organizing pamphlets about health and wellness on a nearby table. The children are so excited to meet you, Caleb. Caleb smiled, adjusting his stethoscope. I just hope I can show them what's possible, like you both showed me. Throughout the morning, Caleb examined the children one by one, taking extra time to chat with each of them. He noticed their eyes widen when they saw his medical degree hanging on the wall, many of them asking questions about how he became a doctor. I used to live here too, he told a small group gathered around him during a break. I know it's not always easy, but with hard work and determination, you can achieve anything you set your mind to. A young girl raised her hand shyly. Even if some people say we can't? Caleb knelt down to her level. Especially then. Sometimes people will doubt you, but what matters is that you believe in yourself. John watched from the doorway, his eyes misty as he observed Caleb's gentle interaction with the children. Look at him, he whispered to Emma. Remember that scared little boy we found on the street? Now he's changing lives. During lunch, Caleb announced the establishment of the Hope Foundation, a fund dedicated to providing scholarships and medical resources for underprivileged children. Every child deserves a chance to pursue their dreams, he declared. This foundation will ensure that financial barriers don't stand in their way. Emma approached him after the announcement, her eyes brimming with tears. We're so proud of you, Caleb. You've taken everything life threw at you and turned it into something beautiful. I learned from the best, Caleb replied, hugging both John and Emma. You showed me what it means to help others, to make a difference. As the afternoon continued, Caleb shared more of his story with the children, answering their questions about medical school and offering advice about overcoming obstacles. The children listened intently, many of them starting to share their own dreams and aspirations. Sometimes the hardest times in our lives can lead us to our purpose, he told them. Each of you has something special to offer the world. Don't let anyone tell you different. The clinic day bustled with activity as Caleb continued providing checkups and medical care. He took time with each child, ensuring they felt heard and valued, just as John and Emma had done for him years ago. The aroma of home-cooked food filled Caleb's modern kitchen as he put the finishing touches on dinner. Through the window, he spotted John and Emma's car pulling into his driveway, right on time for their weekly family dinner. His heart warmed at the sight of them walking up the path, their faces lighting up when he opened the door. Something smells amazing, Emma said, embracing him tightly. I tried recreating your famous pot roast, Caleb admitted with a laugh, though I doubt it'll be as good as yours. John squeezed his shoulder affectionately. I'm sure it'll be perfect, son. They settled around Caleb's dining table, the familiar comfort of family wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Steam rose from the dishes as they passed plates and shared knowing smiles. Remember when you first tried to teach me to cook, Emma? Caleb asked, his eyes twinkling. I nearly burned down the kitchen trying to make pancakes. Emma chuckled. But look at you now, a doctor who can actually cook. I'd say that's quite an achievement. Speaking of being a doctor, John said, helping himself to more vegetables. How are things going at the clinic? Caleb's face lit up as he shared stories about his work. We've expanded the scholarship program. Last week, we helped 3 more kids secure funding for medical school, and the free clinic days at the orphanage are making a real difference. You've helped so many children find their path, Emma said softly, her eyes glistening. Just like we found you that night. The room grew quiet as they all remembered that pivotal evening. John set down his fork, his voice thick with emotion. I still remember seeing you sitting there on that curb, clutching that photograph. I was so scared, Caleb admitted, but something told me I could trust you. Both of you changed my life that night. Emma reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You changed our lives too, sweetheart. You know, Caleb said, his voice catching slightly. I never had the chance to properly thank you both. You're my parents, my real parents. Not just because you took me in, but because you loved me unconditionally, even when I was struggling to trust anyone. John's eyes grew misty. Son, you've been our child since the moment we found you. Nothing will ever change that. "We're so proud of the man you've become," Emma added, wiping away a tear. "And we'll always be here for you. Always be your family." They sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of their words settling around them like a blessing. The evening light filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow over their small family gathering, a testament to the unbreakable bonds they'd forged through love and trust. The message arrived on Caleb's phone during his lunch break. The elderly man's name appeared on the screen, bringing with it a flood of memories. Mr. Harrison, the man who had funded the orphanage years ago, wanted to meet with him. Caleb read the message twice, noting the genuine warmth in the words as Mr. Harrison expressed his desire to see how far Caleb had come. Sitting in his office, Caleb typed a careful reply, agreeing to the meeting. He glanced around at his achievements hanging on the walls, his medical degree, community service awards, and photos of the children he'd helped through his scholarship program. Each one represented a step forward from that tragic night so many years ago. When Mr. Harrison arrived the following afternoon, he moved slowly but purposefully into Caleb's office. His eyes took in the certificates and photographs that lined the walls, lingering on an image of Caleb with a group of children from the orphanage. "Dr. Matthews," Mr. Harrison said softly, using Caleb's professional name with evident pride. "Thank you for seeing me." "Please sit down," Caleb gestured to a comfortable chair. "Would you like some water?" "You've done remarkable things here," Mr. Harrison said, settling into the chair. "I've been following your work with the community, especially your programs for underprivileged children. It's more than I could have hoped for when we first established the orphanage." Caleb noticed the tremor in the elderly man's voice. "Your support made it all possible, Mr. Harrison. That orphanage gave me stability when I needed it most." "I need to apologize again," Mr. Harrison said, his eyes growing moist. "What my wife did, it changed your life forever. But seeing how you've transformed that tragedy into something beautiful, it's helped me find peace. The orphanage you helped build has given countless children a chance at a better life," Caleb responded gently. "Including me. That's your legacy now." Mr. Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I've continued supporting various charitable causes," he explained. "Your story inspired me to do more. Seeing you succeed, watching you help others, it's shown me that even the darkest moments can lead to light." Caleb felt a warmth spread through his chest. "Thank you for coming today," he said. "And thank you for everything you've done. Your support helped me find my path." "No, thank you," Mr. Harrison replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me what true forgiveness and redemption look like. I'll never forget that." They sat together in comfortable silence, two men connected by tragedy, but united in their commitment to making the world better. As Mr. Harrison prepared to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at Caleb with grateful eyes. "You've become an extraordinary man, Dr. Matthews," he said softly. "I'm proud to have played a small part in your journey." The community center buzzed with excitement as people filled the rows of chairs, their voices creating a gentle murmur throughout the spacious room. Caleb sat near the front, dressed in a crisp navy suit, unaware that his name was about to be called. He smiled, watching as various community leaders received recognition for their contributions, applauding genuinely for each recipient. In the third row, John and Emma Matthews sat quietly, exchanging knowing glances. They had kept the nomination a secret, wanting to surprise the man they had come to think of as their son. Emma clutched John's hand tightly as the presenter approached the podium for the final award of the evening. "Our next recipient has demonstrated extraordinary dedication to our community," the presenter began. "Through his medical practice and charitable initiatives, he has created opportunities for countless underprivileged children. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating Dr. Caleb Matthews." Caleb's eyes widened in surprise. He felt a gentle push from the person next to him, encouraging him to stand. As he made his way to the stage, his heart pounded with emotion. The spotlight illuminated his path, and when he reached the podium, he could see John and Emma clearly in the audience, both wiping tears from their eyes. Taking a deep breath, Caleb began to speak. "This recognition is unexpected and deeply humbling," he said, his voice steady despite his emotion. "But I wouldn't be standing here today without two incredible people who changed my life forever." John and Emma Matthews saw a scared, lonely boy sitting on a curb one night, and they chose to stop. They chose to care. He paused, looking directly at them. "You didn't just give me a safe place to stay. You gave me love, support, and the belief that I could become something more than my circumstances. This award belongs to you both because you taught me what it means to truly make a difference in someone's life." Emma pressed her hand to her heart, tears flowing freely now. John wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his own eyes glistening with pride. "To everyone here tonight," Caleb continued, "I want to challenge you to look for opportunities to help others. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change someone's entire life. I know this because I lived it. One police officer's decision to stop his car that night led to everything I am today." His voice grew stronger as he concluded. "We all have the power to impact lives, whether it's through mentoring, volunteering, or simply showing compassion to someone in need. Each of us can create positive change. Thank you for this honor, and thank you to my parents, John and Emma Matthews, for showing me the way." As applause filled the room, Caleb stepped down from the stage. John and Emma met him halfway, enveloping him in a tight embrace. Emma cupped his face in her hands, just as she had done when he was a boy, while John clasped his shoulder firmly, his eyes conveying all the pride words couldn't express. The renovated orphanage buzzed with excitement as children filled the bright, colorful community room. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating the space where dozens of young faces turned toward Caleb, who stood at the front with a warm smile. The walls, once drab and institutional, now displayed children's artwork and inspirational quotes, making the space feel like a true home. "I stood right where you are now," Caleb began, his voice gentle yet carrying throughout the room. "In fact, I used to sit in that very corner." He pointed to a reading nook filled with comfortable cushions. "I know what it feels like to think you're alone, to wonder if anyone understands what you're going through." A small boy in the front row raised his hand timidly. "Were you scared?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was terrified," Caleb admitted, nodding. "But then something amazing happened. Two people chose to care about me, Officer John Matthews and his wife Emma. They showed me that family isn't just about blood, it's about love and support." He moved closer to the children, sitting on the edge of the stage to be at their level. "That's why I created this scholarship fund. I want each of you to know that your dreams matter, that your future matters. No matter what challenges you face, you can overcome them." A girl with braids raised her hand next. "I want to be a doctor like you," she said proudly. "But some people say I can't because I'm different." Caleb leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. "People said the same thing to me. But here's what I learned. Those who try to limit you are usually the ones who are afraid of how far you can go. Your differences are your strength." He stood up and walked among the children, making eye contact with each one. "This scholarship fund isn't just money for school. It's a promise that someone believes in you. Just like John and Emma believed in me, I believe in each of you." More hands shot up, and Caleb answered each question patiently. When a shy boy mentioned his interest in science, Caleb's face lit up. "You know, I started with just a curious mind and lots of questions. Now I help people every day as a doctor. Your curiosity is the first step toward something amazing." As the questions continued, Caleb shared stories of his struggles and triumphs, watching understanding dawn in their eyes. These children saw themselves in his story, their own challenges, fears, and hopes reflected in his journey. "The scholarship fund will help with education, books, tutoring, whatever you need to chase your dreams," he explained. "But remember, the most important thing isn't the money. It's believing in yourself, even when things get tough." Looking out at the sea of hopeful faces, Caleb felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He saw determination in their eyes, the same determination that had carried him through his darkest days. These children weren't just listening to his story, they were beginning to believe in their own potential. The aroma of Emma's home cooking filled the warm kitchen as Caleb sat at the familiar dinner table with John and Emma. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a gentle glow over the family gathering. The sound of clinking plates mingled with soft laughter as they shared stories over Emma's famous pot roast. "Remember that first night?" John asked, his eyes twinkling with memory. "You were so quiet, clutching that photograph like it was your lifeline." Caleb nodded, his expression softening. "I was terrified, but something about both of you made me feel safe, even then." Emma reached across the table, squeezing his hand gently. "You've come so far since that night, sweetheart. We're so proud of the man you've become." "I couldn't have done it without you both," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my parents in every way that matters. You showed me what family really means." John cleared his throat, fighting back tears. "Son, having you in our lives has been one of our greatest blessings." Emma stood up suddenly, excitement dancing in her eyes. "Oh, I have something for you." She hurried to the living room and returned with a beautifully bound photo album. "I've been working on this for a while." Caleb opened the album carefully. The first page showed a newspaper clipping about the orphanage's opening. As he turned the pages, he saw photos of his graduation, his first day of medical school, and countless family moments in between. Each image told a story of love, growth, and triumph. "These are all our memories together," Emma explained softly. "Every important moment, every milestone. I wanted you to have something tangible to remind you of how far you've come." Tears welled in Caleb's eyes as he looked at his parents, for that's truly what they were. "I don't know how to thank you both. You didn't just give me a home, you gave me a future, a family, everything." "You don't need to thank us," John said firmly. "That's what family does. We'll always be here for you, son. Always." They sat together, sharing more stories and memories, their laughter and love filling the house just as it had for all these years. The photo album lay open on the table, a testament to their journey together, while outside, the setting sun painted the sky in warm hues that matched the glow in their hearts. If you enjoyed the story of Caleb, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.